מזמור לדוד. אדוני רואי לו אכסר, בינות דשא ירביצני. על מי מנוחות ינהלני, נפשי ישובב. ינחני במעגלי צדק, למען שמו. גם כי אלך בגיא צל מוות, לא אירא רע כי אתה עמדי. שבטך ומשענתך המה ינחמוני. תערוך לפני שולחן נגד צורריי, תשענת בשמן ראשי, כוסי רוויה. הכתוב החסד ילדפוני, כל ימי חיי. ושבתי בבית אדוני לאורך ימים.
Before we continue, I'd like you to do what I'm about to do and take out your cell phone and turn it off, please. Thank you. In the psalm which Rabbi Green just chanted, of course you recognize that. Can you hear me in the back? You recognize that as the 23rd psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." There are any number of reasons that song is chanted at a funeral. One of the most obvious reasons is that it describes the person's faith, that yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Our tradition has it that psalm is not said for us, but it's said for the soul, in this case Judy's soul, that's making its journey from this dimension of reality to another dimension of reality. And therefore we are here, as the psalm says, as shepherds, to help shepherd the soul. Our tradition has it that as difficult as it is for us to depart from those who have died, it is equally difficult, if not more difficult, for the soul to depart from us, because parting is not sweet sorrow, it's very deep bitterness. So we are here then to shepherd a soul. We are also here in the role of shepherds to bring comfort to the mourners, and that's called in Hebrew Nachum Avelim, to bring comfort to those who mourn. We bring comfort in different ways and at different times. In this case, though for those of you who will join us at the funeral, at the cemetery for the kfurah, for the burial, you'll have an opportunity to do that there. For those who opt not to go to the cemetery, we should be back here in, I would think, about 1-ish, and then you can be here at the meal of condolence to provide the appropriate words and gestures of condolence. On Sunday, I got to make sure I get this right, at Lanark, the family will be receiving all of you would like to come from 1 to 4 and from 7 to 9, okay? And that will happen again on Monday from 1 to 4, 7 to 9. Now, Tuesday night starts the holiday of Shavuot, and all major Jewish holidays cancel out the Shiva. So essentially the Shiva ends on Tuesday. There will be an opportunity to visit the family again at the family home from 10 to 12. And if that's a little complicated, you can check with us a little bit later on. But the Shiva does end Tuesday, and that completes it. That's the nature of a Jewish observance, because community celebration, the holiday, is always is seen as we see our suffering always in the context of the larger reality of our community and our history. Also, those of you who would like to send flowers or gifts, those are graciously declined in favor of tzedakah, of charity given to the local Jewish Child and Family Services, whose staff and whose love and skill are so much appreciated by the family. So I will have an opportunity to repeat that a couple of times. The most important thing, of course, is that we are here, and we want to bring kavod, we want to bring honor to Judy's memory, and we want to bring comfort to all of us who are mourners. I want to just point out to you that on the Jewish calendar, today is the beginning of the new lunar month. We call that in Hebrew Rosh Chodesh. This is a particularly important Rosh Chodesh, new moon, because it is several days before the holiday of Shavuot. I mention that because holidays and all of the traditions of Judaism were so very important to Judy and her family. And in our context, we want to be able to honor the Jewishness of Judy and her family. A Jewishness, as many of you know, which was hard-won and had many, many obstacles to it. Those who will be speaking, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. You may not know everybody.
Hi, I'm Ann Weiszmann.
If you can't hear Ann, just raise your hand to talk louder.
Okay, hi, sorry.
A little closer to that.
So, my name is Ann Weiszmann, Judith's daughter, and this is my brother Paul. And while I wrote this as if I was just writing it myself, and I say my mom or my mother, I'm actually saying this on behalf of both Paul and I. I hope you'll bear with me when I... They're still not hearing me? I don't know how to do that. Like this? Okay, thank you. Is that better? Okay. Okay. My mom was born on January 30th, 1930 in Budapest, Hungary. Sorry, you can tell I don't do a lot of public speaking. She was the only child of Andor and Katalin Kopstein, a Jewish timber merchant who imported and exported building materials to several European countries, Sweden being among them. My grandfather's business connections to Sweden proved to be life-saving in 1944, but more on that later. My mom had a very tranquil childhood right up until the start of the Second World War. Her family were upper middle-class Jews who lived in an upscale apartment in central Budapest. As was the custom, my mom had a nanny from the time of her birth. According to my grandmother Kitty, there was a series of several nannies employed to care for my mom until she was 3, none of whom met with my grandparents' nor my mother's approval. When my mom was 3, an Austrian Montessori-trained nanny, Tilly, was hired. My mom apparently bonded with Tilly immediately. Tilly went on to become not only my mom's nanny, but a cherished close friend, confidant, and ultimately a righteous Gentile who had a very big part in saving my mother's family during the Holocaust. Tilly spoke to my mom almost entirely in German. As a result of this, my mother had complete proficiency in German from a very young age. Tilly stayed in the family's employ until Jews were no longer allowed to employ Gentiles, but the family's friendship and my mom's very deep maternal-child relationship with Tilly endured until Tilly's death in her late 90s a few years ago. She was almost like a second mother to her. As a child, my mom's summers consisted of carefree, bucolic months at the extended family's summer home compound in Római-Fürdő. Római-Fürdő is about an hour outside of Budapest on the banks of the Danube. The entire Samek-Kopstein family, and there were 11 siblings, along with their spouses and children, would gather at the compound for the summer months. While my mom was an only child, she was very, very close with her large extended family from her father's side. The grandmothers, mothers, and children would transplant themselves out to Római-Fürdő for the entire summer, while the menfolk of the family commuted back and forth to Budapest via train so that they could maintain their businesses. The children had pretty much free rein to frolic together from dawn to dusk. My mom often spoke of these summers as filled with warm family memories of the adventures with her cousins Marta, Zsuzsi, Yuri, Erika, and Aniko. She always talked of all the delicious Hungarian food that was prepared out in the Római-Fürdő. These were clearly the best times of her pre-war life. I'm sure you can all relate to how many fascinating my mother had about her life experiences. My mom and I always loved to look at old family photo albums together. I found that they were a window to help me draw the stories of her life out from her. My grandfather was quite the photographer, and by sheer good fortune, many of the old photo albums survived the war, and my mother and I loved poring over the pictures over the years. Some of them survived with literally bullet holes through them because bullets came into the apartment and through the albums. So we're incredibly fortunate that we had these memories. I loved poring over the pictures over the years with my mom. Indeed, a few short weeks ago, when my mom was already at Riverview, I brought in some family photo albums for her to reminisce over. Together, we found dozens of pictures that attest to just how much fun they had at Római-Fürdő. My grandparents were very particular about providing my mom with plenty of exposure to culture such as classical music, opera, and fine art. My mother particularly remembered very fondly the day-long excursions she took with my grandfather to various museums on the weekends. That was their weekend pastime. So fun and learning together. Even prior to the war, there were currents of anti-Semitism in Hungary. Recently, my mother recalled that in grade 1, in 1936, a classmate refused to sit beside her when she found out she was Jewish. When the teacher asked the young girl why she didn't want to sit beside my mom, she replied, because she is a dirty Jew. Understandably, my mom said she found this very jarring as a young child. My mother's family's life changed profoundly as the war carried on. My mom often spoke of how she had been robbed of her childhood by the war. Her sense of security vanished, not to be fully regained until long after she immigrated to Canada. First, there were the anti-Jewish laws. Jews were forced to wear a yellow star that marked them as Jews. Jewish businesses were forced to close. Jews were ordered to surrender their radios, bicycles, telephones, pianos, and all their jewelry. Jews' bank accounts were taken over by the state. My mom recalled how she ran out of the house impulsively one day, only to realize that she had, thank you, Paul, that she had not put on her coat with the yellow star sewn onto it. She said that the terror that ran through her veins as she raced to get home before someone recognized her as a Jew without their star stayed with her for years afterwards. She could have been shot on the spot for that misadventure. The deportation of the Budapest Jewish population was planned for mid-July 1944. With the understanding that the Hungarian Jews were the only, and I say this in quotations, nearly intact Jewish community in Europe, the World Jewish Congress and the American War Refugee Board approached King Gustav of Sweden to see if Sweden would be willing to be involved with a rescue mission of the Hungarian Jews. After a serious search, Raoul Wallenberg was found to be the most capable and willing person to organize this rescue mission. Wallenberg had previous business connections in Budapest. He arrived in Budapest on July 9th of 1944 to become part of the Swedish embassy's staff. He had large sums of foreign currency at his disposal to be used for whatever he deemed necessary to support a rescue operation. This was to include the bribing of Nazi officials, purchasing food, and living accommodations. Following a meeting between Wallenberg and Admiral Horthy, the head of the Hungarian government, the deportations of the Budapest Jews were temporarily halted. Neutral embassies of countries such as Switzerland and Portugal started issuing protective papers in the summer of 1944, but unfortunately, for the most part, these were not accepted by the authorities, the Nazi authorities. Wallenberg designed a document that resembled a Swedish passport. The document noted that the bearer was to be repatriated to Sweden and until such time was under the protection of the Swedish crown. The first Schutzpasses were issued for those who already had family members or business relations already living in Sweden. My grandfather got a telegram from the Swedish embassy in Budapest informing him that his business associate in Stockholm was willing to sponsor their family for these so-called Schutzpasses. They were to report to the embassy with passport photos for each member of the family as soon as possible. On August 20th, my mom's family each received a Swedish Schutzpass. Her Schutzpass issuance number was number 145. Wallenberg went on to issue many thousands more of these life-saving documents. On October 15th, 1944, Szálasi and a militant Hungarian Nazi mob, the Hungarian Arrow Cross, took control of Hungary in a coup d'etat. My mother and grandmother tried to hide, but were denounced to the Hungarian Nazis by a former employee of my mother's maternal grandmother. They were taken by the Hungarian Gestapo to a railway yard in order that they be deported. My mom always suspected, or the driver was trying to take them to a railway yard to be deported. My mother always suspected that the driver was sabotaging the truck they were in, as they had several flat tires on the way to the railway yard, so did not get to the rail station in time for that day's deportation train. Because they missed that train, they were taken to Nazi headquarters to stay the night in order that they be handily put onto one of the deportation trains the next day. My mother and grandmother repeatedly said they were Swedes and begged that they not be deported. My mom always thought that someone had tipped off the Swedish legation that they were at the police station, as over the course of that night, Wallenberg and his staff showed up and demanded that they be released. They were, in fact, miraculously released from the Hungarian Nazi headquarters and left with Wallenberg and his staff. My mother's father spoke 6 languages, including German and Serbian, and volunteered to be of assistance to the Swedish legation. He worked directly with Wallenberg and assisted in organizing various rescue missions and in trying to track down individuals who had disappeared. In November 1944, as holders of Swedish Schutzpasses, my mother and her family moved into a house marked as being under the protection of the Swedish crown. While conditions were crowded and food was very scarce, it was considerably safer for my mom's family there than it would have been anywhere else in Budapest. Over the course of the next few months, my mom's former nanny, Tilly, Austrian Catholic Tilly, showed incredible bravado and courage and took provisions and currency that my grandfather had given to her to hide on their behalf to my mother's family at the Swedish safe house. This was, of course, at considerable risk to herself. Had she been caught, Tilly surely would have been shot on the spot. Without those provisions and the money that they were given by her and were then able to buy provisions, without those they would not have survived. They would have starved to death, as many did. After the liberation of Budapest, my mum discovered that her 9-year-old cousin Marika, who was really like a little sister to her, had been gassed in Auschwitz, along with Marika's mother and grandmother. Further, my mum lost several cousins from Békéscsaba in rural Hungary to the Auschwitz gas chambers. These losses left her with wounds that endured to the end of her life. Following the liberation of Budapest, Wallenberg asked to be put in contact with the Russian High Command in order that he be permitted to go to the countryside to secure food for the starving population of Budapest. The Russian commander's delegate came to the Swedish legation where he met with Wallenberg and my grandfather on the street. My grandfather went out with Wallenberg because he spoke Serbian. Wallenberg didn't speak Russian, so my grandfather was able with his Serbian to make do and understand what the Russians were saying and tell Wallenberg. My grandfather translated for Wallenberg as he spoke no Russian. My grandfather made do with his knowledge of Serbian. The Russians asked that Wallenberg follow them to the Russian High Command. Prior to getting in his chauffeured car, Wallenberg turned to my grandfather and asked him, I guess rhetorically, "Do you think these men are my liberators or my captors?" My mum watched this exchange from the doorway of the Swedish safe house across the street from the Swedish legation, and my grandfather later relayed the actual conversation to her. This was the last time that Wallenberg was seen as a free man. During the summer of 1948, my mum went to a camp for Jewish university students. I believe this camp was funded by an American aid organization. Most of the campers were Holocaust survivor orphans. My mum was one of the very, very few lucky campers who had survived the Holocaust along with her parents. It was at this summer camp where she met my father. All the campers and the camp director, who happened to be my father, were on a train out to the camp. My mum was with one of her friends who quickly introduced my parents to each other. Apparently, my father was struggling to figure out how he was going to make ends meet in order to run the camp with the slim budget that he had to work with. My mum sat down beside him and offered to help him figure out how to manage. She had done accounting for her father's timber import-export company and was well-versed in budgeting and accounting practices. The way my mother always told this story is that she started helping him sort out the camp's books in 1948, and that she never really stopped working with him on various projects until his passing in 2011. This was the beginning of a lifetime partnership, a loving marriage, and business and personal lives that lasted 63 years. When my mum graduated from high school in 1948, it was just after the communists had seized power in Hungary, and university acceptance for a Jewish woman from an upper middle class background would have been a mere faint hope. So with a little creative editing of her application papers, forgery, she gained admission and graduated with her structural engineering degree from the Technical University in 1954. My late father, Erwin Weiszmann, also graduated from the same university with a degree in engineering. My mum worked at the Industrial Design Institute in Budapest after graduation and later became the head of the structural engineering section of the Pest County Engineering Design Center. During this time, my mum completed all of the compulsory courses for a master's degree in engineering, but was unable to complete her final thesis because she and my dad left Hungary following the failed Hungarian Revolution in 1956. My parents were both very ambitious and did not wait around in a refugee camp for a country to accept them. Rather, they looked for and secured jobs in Austria as civil engineers at the Reuter textile factory in Tyrol, Austria, and later at the Industrial Building Corporation of Austria in Baden by Wien, while waiting for their papers in order to immigrate to Canada. While life was good in the spectacular Tyrolean Alps, my parents decided that the Iron Curtain was much, much too close for comfort. They wished to start a new life in a democratic, English-speaking country. They applied to immigrate to Canada and were accepted as refugees in 1957. In August 1957, my parents arrived in Montreal with 2 backpacks, their engineering degrees, my father's Telescent fill-in, and a grand total of $70 between the 2 of them. Talk about a hard start. My mom got a job working for Latendre and Monty engineering consultants in Montreal, Quebec. Very soon after that, they moved to Winnipeg in November of 1957, and my mom began working for Smith Carter Kotelnikoff Architects and for Crozier, Krauss and Partners Consulting Engineers, while my father worked at Winnipeg Hydro. He and my mother established Weiszmann and Associates Consulting Engineers in 1959. When my mom applied for registration with the Association of Professional Engineers of Manitoba in January 1958, she was advised that the Technical University of Budapest was not on the Association of Professional Engineers of Manitoba's list of approved universities, and she was denied registration. To my mom, this seemed so incredibly unfair because her university was formerly named the Royal József Nádor Technical University of Hungary, which was on the approved list. After seizing power, the communists renamed the university for political reasons, and everything else remained the same. Not to mention, my father's registration, who fortunately graduated prior to the name change, was approved without a question. This was very frustrating for my mom, but like she always did, she just pressed on. So for the next several years, my mom concurrently worked full-time for Weiszmann and Associates while writing 6 qualifying exams in order that she'd be able to get her registration. She raised a family and she wrote a thesis. I can't even imagine it. My parents became Canadian citizens in 1963, proudly adopting Canada as their chosen country. My mom persevered and was finally registered with the Association of Professional Engineers of Manitoba in 1969, making her the second woman ever to register with this organization. My mom missed being the first by 1 month. When they finished practicing many years later, she was still the only woman in the province who was practicing as a consulting engineer as opposed to being an employee of a firm. It wasn't easy for women engineers in Manitoba in those early years. I have heard many stories of how my mom had to overcome gender discrimination and the fact that her expertise, background, and judgment were scrutinized to a higher degree than her colleagues because of her gender. I recall that as a child, there was always a second shift of workers coming to the basement home office to work on urgent projects. So they would work downtown, regular hours during the day. They would come home, my mom would make us dinner, and then the second shift would come at 7 o'clock, and they'd work till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And then they would get up and do it all over again the next day. My mom certainly did much more than double duty, working 2 shifts as an engineer and then 1 more as a mom and homemaker. The business was a very vibrant part of the whole family's life. Both Paul and I worked on and off for Weiszmann Associates from a very young age, whether it was attending at a construction site to take measurements, delivering plans, photocopying specs, or proofreading. This was truly a family business. Having overcome the barriers to her success over the 48-plus years as a structural engineer, my mom completed over 450 projects for industrial, commercial, municipal, and residential buildings. She inspected and reported on over 900 residential buildings. In 1995, my mom was honored to receive the Association of Professional Engineers of Manitoba Merit Award for her pioneering work in the field of engineering, and she earned the right to become a Fellow of Engineers Canada, their highest honor. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. She was a life member of the Association of the Professional Engineers and Geoscientists Manitoba. She was very, very actively involved in the safety committee of the association for decades. She was kind of the cornerstone who had the historical memory and would always know, oh, but we did something different last time. They really valued her expertise. After 48 years of a busy engineering practice, my parents retired in 2007, and they spent many winters enjoying the beauty and climate of Hawaii. I always teased them that they only came home to Winnipeg for the purpose of doing their tax returns and changing the furnace filter on Lanark. Several visits were made annually to Toronto to see the grandchildren and to celebrate birthdays and Jewish holidays. My mom took great pleasure in the accomplishments of her children and grandchildren. There was a special place in her heart for Gabriel and Adrian, who referred to her as Nagy, a shortened version of the Hungarian term for grandmother. My mother was exceedingly proud of Gabriel's graduation and acceptance to university, and of Adrian's academic achievements. One of my mom's proudest moments was at the kotel with Gabriel when he read Torah for his bar mitzvah. Both of my parents really felt like they had triumphed over Hitler. Here they were, proud Jews at the kotel with the next two generations of their family. When diagnosed with cancer this January, the knowledge that she would be most not likely able to attend Adrian's bar mitzvah in 2 years was one of her greatest regrets. My mom was a very charitable person, having never forgotten the hard start she had as a former refugee. She was always willing to assist newcomer engineers and technicians in settling into practicing their professions in their newly adopted country. My mom was a believer in educating future generations about the devastating effects of the Holocaust. She gave of her time very generously for decades to high schools and universities lecturing on the Holocaust. She hoped that by teaching future generations about the historical background of the Holocaust, that hatred leading to such cataclysm could be avoided in the future. In 2012, marking the 100th anniversary of Raoul Wallenberg's birth, the Swedish Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp. Before doing so, the stamp designer contacted Wallenberg's half-sister Nina Lagergren about the possible design of the stamp. Nina provided the designer with a copy of my mom's Schutzpass. My mom had given Nina a copy of her Schutzpass in 1997 when Nina was in Toronto to attend the unveiling of a statue honoring her half-brother Raoul. At the time the stamp was created, no one in the Swedish Postal Service had any idea that my mom had survived the war. In 2013, Canada Post also issued a Wallenberg stamp featuring my mom's Schutzpass in the same fashion as the Swedes had done. My mom was exceedingly proud and humbled to find her Schutzpass on both the Canadian and Swedish Wallenberg stamps. The story about my mother being on the stamp circulated rapidly within the Jewish community across Canada and among organizations that deal with Holocaust education and race relations. And the demand for speaking engagements grew. My mom held human rights experts, academics, Holocaust educators, and high school and university students equally spellbound in her description of the events that occurred in and around the Nazi occupation and after the arrival of Wallenberg. As a result of an invitation to speak at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance conference in Toronto in October 2013, my mother received a further invitation from the Canadian government to speak at another International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance conference as their guest of honor in February 2014 in Stockholm. I accompanied my mother, and she was very, very sick by then, and she kept saying, you know, my body is not bringing me here, it's my mind. I have to do this. It's just something I have to do. And she was able to pull herself together. She was already very sick, and go speak to these people. This invitation gave my mother the opportunity to realize a lifelong dream, to travel to Wallenberg's homeland. The stories she told of her survival experiences resonated as deeply with the Swedish audience as they did with those in Canada. My mother felt an enormous debt of gratitude to Wallenberg, and when speaking about the Holocaust, she always underscored the good that one person could do. She also had two other key messages. Pay attention to the pockets of anti-Semitism springing up in parts of Europe and North America, and that living in peace with your neighbors is much better than the alternative. She was a wonderful woman. I'm going to miss her terribly. She was much more than just my mom. She was my best friend. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Adrian. Thank you for listening to my mom's speech, and this is mine. I was really close to my Naji. Naji means grandmother in Hungarian, in case you didn't know, because my mom told you. My Naji was a very special lady, and a lady engineer. I will always love her and never forget her. Since she was a Holocaust survivor, she told me all about her life during the Holocaust and how Raoul Wallenberg saved her and my Papa's life. Papa means grandfather in Hungarian. I found everything that she told me about the Holocaust so scary, yet really fascinating. My Naji was born in Budapest and died at the great age of 84 years old. My Naji came to Canada as a refugee in 1956. I will always love my Naji and never ever forget how nice she was to me. She will always be an inspiration to me. She was so brave even though she had many challenges during her life.
Each time that I have the privilege to attend the Levaya, the funeral of a Holocaust survivor, I'm struck by the fact that each funeral is really a victory. I think Judy and Erwin understood that deeply when they stood at the kotel. In fact, the fact that we're all here, that we're in a synagogue, that the words of prayer, which are ancient Hebrew words, is really nothing less than a great miracle. I know how deeply and how long we have celebrated the holiday of Purim, but I suspect in future generations that the salvation of the Jews of the Holocaust and our survival will really outstrip the miracle of Purim. So I know how deeply sad we all are, but I think Judy would be the first person to tell us that we needed to rejoice. How do I know this? I sat at the bedside with Judy one Motzei Shabbat, one late Saturday night. We've been friends for a very long time, the three of us. I don't know, in terms of Holocaust education, who discovered the Weizmanns first, myself, or was it you or I who first discovered the Weizmanns?
She said it was me. You came along with it.
Okay. We began Holocaust education in the 70s, myself at the University of Vida at what used to be called Joseph Walensky. And I asked around because the way I set the course up was one semester was the documentary history of the Holocaust. The second, I wanted people in the class to learn not the documentary history, but the human history. And I was fortunate enough to be able to find people who were prepared to come and speak. And Judy and Erwin were those people. I could give you a long list of others. How fortunate I was. They became my friends and my mentors. So we sat and we talked all about this. And I said to Judy, you know, I remember a couple of things from the first night that you spoke. First, they told the same story in such different ways. It was incredible. It wasn't only that they were a little bit of age difference, but there was a personality and approach. But there was humor. And I remember there were a couple of things, but the one I will always remember is Erwin, saying, there was this Admiral Horthy. He was the head of Hungary. He said the strange thing was that Hungary didn't have a navy. He said, but that's the way the government was run. A country could be run by an admiral that didn't have a navy. So there was good humor. All of this we remember as I held her hand. She spoke of the great pride that she had in her grandchildren, the wonderful events of the bar mitzvah. And she also said to me how she realized that how she grew as a result of being this person who talked to many people about the Holocaust. We went on and on like that. I was amazed that she had the stamina to talk so long. I want to finish this in two different ways. I want to say, first of all, there is a Talmud says, Shaliach ose shaliach. If a person is deputized to do a task, he can re-deputize somebody else. Judy, Erwin, many of you here in the room regard yourselves as the voice of those who did not survive. You regard yourself as the voice of celebration. You are the shalichim of that whole epic in our history. And as I listened to Judy that time and many other times, I realized that she was deputizing me and you and all of us to be shlichim, to be messengers who are messengers of a messenger. And therefore we all have the obligation, each of us in our own way, to tell this story, yes, for all its pain, but for its triumph as well. And this is a moment of triumph. The other way I want to end, and I don't know if I can get to the end of this. At the end, I looked at Judy, we smiled, and I said, would you like to say the Shema? And we did. We chanted the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And I kissed her hand for the last time, and we smiled at each other. And that moment will reside with me for as long as I have consciousness. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Erwin. Before I ask Rabbi Green to say the El Moli Rachamim, Judy's name will be included in the El Moli Rachamim. But I'd also suggested, as the El Moli Rachamim said, this memorial prayer, that you bear in mind Raoul Warrenberg, whose place of death, whose burial, if he was ever buried, we don't know. And also the very brave nurse, what was her name, Tilly? That she, in your mind, also be included in the El Moli Rachamim. At the conclusion, we'll ask you to remain in your seats. The family will then leave to go out in the hall. They will walk behind the casket. For those of you who are coming to the cemetery, please be very careful in following along. For those of you who cannot, I would imagine we'll be back here. I have to revise my schedule, probably around 1:45. You're welcome to stay in the building, or you're welcome to come back. I ask you to please rise, and Rabbi Green.
Moli Rachamim Shochen Bamramim Hametzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashchina B'ma'alot kedoshim v'teharim Kezohar rakia mazhirim Et nishmat Yehudit bat Moshe ve'Esther Shehalcha le'olama B'gan Eden Tehe menuchatam Lachen barachamim Yastireha beseter kenafav le'olamim Ve'itzror b'itzror achayim Et nishmata Adonai honachlata V'tanuach b'shalom Al mishkava